Hi there, and welcome to our discussion on the axial skeleton. So, let's talk about the axial skeleton versus the appendicular skeleton. That's going to be for a different video. So, the axial skeleton are basically they're going to include the bones of the head and the trunk. They're going to form the longitudinal, right, the long axis of the body. The appendicular skeleton are going to be the bones that support the limbs. A lot of times we think just the limbs, but it's also the bones that support the limbs. So this is a nice little breakdown. You're going to see this probably on both of the PowerPoints, on both of the videos. So you can see here to break down between the axial skeleton, and then you'll see the appendicular skeleton in the next set of figures. So the axial skeleton, 80 bones, right? For the entire skeletal system, 206 bones. And I guarantee you're going to get tested on that. So the axial skeleton, 80 bones. We have ourselves, excuse me, with that, if you want to break it down to these three sections, the skull and associated bones, thoracic cage, and the vertebral column. So vertebral columns, 26 bones, thoracic cage, 25 bones. You got your skull and associated bones, it's going to be 29 bones. And we're going to further break this down into the skull and associated bones. So looking into the skull, we can have two separations between the cranium, right, and the face. So the cranium has 8 cranial bones, and the face has 14 facial bones. Going into the associated bones, those are going to be the auditory ossicles, which are basically going to make up the inner ear. You're going to have 6 bones for those, and the hyoid. The hyoid is a free-floating bone. It's going to be just one. So looking into the thoracic cage, you're going to have your sternum, just one of those, and 24 ribs. Okay, so that's where you get 25 from, right? 24 ribs. We get 12 on each side. So the vertebral column, 26 bones, break it up. The vertebrae, you have 24 vertebrae. You have your sacrum, 1, and your coccyx, 1. So the thing about the sacrum, it is actually a series of fused bones. So most of the time you have 1, but it's not uncommon to have the lack of fusion. Same thing goes with the coccyx. And I'll be honest with you, these bones, 206, yeah, that's the average, right? But I'll just tell you that sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. Okay. So this is just a broken down of that axial skeleton. It shows you the skull, the sternum, and the 3 parts of the sternum, the ribs on both sides. You have your costal cartilage that is going to basically encompass the anterior portion of the ribs, excuse me. You have your lumbar vertebrae is shown here, right? You got your thoracic vertebrae when you see from the back, because that's just a better picture of that, your cervical vertebrae. When I say from the back, I'm talking about from the posterior direction. We're talking directionality, so that's really important. And here's your sacrum. You can even see how they could be fused bones. Same thing with the coccyx. So what are we going to learn? We are going to learn to identify the bones of the axial skeleton and their specific functions, okay? I already went through all of the numbers when I said the previous slide. So the functions of that axial skeleton is to support and protect the organs of the body. That is the point. We have to protect the most important organs, the brain. You have to protect your internal organs. The most important internal organs, right, are protected by that rib cage. The less important ones, a little less protection, okay? I wasn't pointing to the spine. I was pointing to the open space. Okay, so what else does it do? Provides points of attachment for muscles. Those are going to adjust the positions of the head, neck, and trunk. It's going to help to perform breathing movements. help to stabilize the appendicular skeleton. And so we talked about all of the numbers, and so I'm not just going to keep repeating myself on the numbers, but we really should know and understand how to identify the bones, the foramina, which are the small holes. You could also call them foramen. It really depends on the diameter of the hole. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, depending on the source that you're looking at, and it's fine. Um, and also fissures of the cranium and the face. Okay, should be able to explain the significance of the markings, the individual markings of those individual bones. And so we talked about the skull having 22 bones. 8 of those are cranial bones, and they form the cranium. Okay, so the calvaria is called the skull's cap, and you have that enclosed cranial cavity. That's going to contain the brain. Of this skull, you have 14 facial bones. Purpose is to protect and support entrances to the digestive and the respiratory tracts. They're for pretty too, but really they have function. So as you see here, just kind of looking into those divisions, it's not just about the large bones of the cranium. You have smaller ones that are also going to support the interior portion, the deeper portions of it. So in your cranium, those 8 bones are going to include your occipital bone, your parietal bone. Okay. And by the way, so there's one occipital bone, but there's 2 parietal bones, one right and one left on the other side. Your frontal bone, one frontal bone. So you see the numbers here. Temporal bone, you got one on each side, one right, one left. Sphenoid, the sphenoid bone here, and your ethmoid bone right here. Now, these have very distinct parts to them, but we're going to go ahead and do it in the large sphenoid part and the ethmoid part right now. So going into the facial bones, of those 14 facial bones, you have your maxilla. And the maxilla is going to be that upper portion that is going to make that superior portion of the jaw. They don't really call that the jaw as much as the mandible, but together they do make um, the jaw forces. Okay, and so you have your palatine bones. So your maxilla, you have 2. Not really showing it here because they are giving you a lateral version of it, but you have one right and one left maxilla, and they're going to have a suture down the middle. You have same thing with the palatine bone. Okay, so the palatine bone, you're going to have same thing with the nasal bone. The what is called the inferior nasal concha. Not all of these are shown right now, but we will get to see many pictures later. Zygomatic bone essentially is going to make the cheekbone that you so know and love. Your lacrimal bone, that's going to be like that inner portion of your eye. Your vomer, that's going to be one of them, and your mandible. The mandible is one large piece, while the maxilla is a right and a left. The associated bones that we talked about, the hyoid bone. This is that free floating bone that we discussed. This is going to aid in breathing. It's going to also aid in vocalization. We'll talk about that when we get to it. Um, Auditory ossicles. And so this is going to be the bones of your inner ear. You have 6 of them, 3 on each side. All right, so with your facial bones, you're going to have 9 superficial bones. And the purpose of those is for muscle attachment. You're going to have 5 deeper facial bones, okay? And those are going to separate the oral and the nasal cavities. They are going to increase the surface area of the nasal cavity. Okay, the surface area of the nasal cavity is actually very important in breathing. And they're also going to help to form that nasal septum. So these sutures, you are going to be great. By the way, you're going to be graded on all of this. Please refer to your lab list of bones. They're not only needed to know for the lab, you need to know them for the lecture too. So essentially, if it is on these PowerPoints, it is testable. And so, in addition to your exam reviews. So let's talk about the different types of sutures. Okay, so you have immovable sutures. Those are basically going to form the joints of the skull. We're not moving them around. Now, on an infant, they're a lot more movable. Okay. But at some point, they're very fixed, but not 100% fixed. But the thing is they're not going to be just moving around for functional purpose. I think that's a good take home on that one. All right, so you have four major sutures: lambdoid suture, coronal suture, sagittal suture, and your squamous suture. And I'll show you how kind of how to remember those. Your lambdoid suture. That's going to separate occipital from the parietals. Okay. You might also have some wormy and bones in between those sutural bones. Your coronal suture, that is going to attach the frontal bone to the parietal bones. Okay. Sagittal suture is going to go down that sagittal plane. So it's going to go be the suture between the parietal bones, basically extending from the lambdoid towards that coronal. Think about coronal or crown. And then you have your squamous suture. That's going to join the temporal bones with the parietal bones. Let me show you what those look like. So we're looking from the posterior part of the skull. Here is your occipital bone. And the lambdoid suture is the one in the back between the occipital bone and the parietal bone. Then, well, let's go on this one. You also have your sagittal suture. Your sagittal suture is going to go along that sagittal plane and separate the parietal bones. You can see again here. Boom. So we are looking at the frontal bone. So this is the anterior portion of the body. The frontal bone is going to be separated from the parietal bones with that coronal suture. You could always think about where a crown sits, maybe. And the squamous suture. Here we go, my squamous suture. The squamous suture is going to be what separates the temporal bone from the other bones. As you can see, the squamous suture articulates with the parietal bone, right? And then coming down all the way. So I always like to say, see how it kind of encompasses near the ear? Well, think about when you lay on the side of your head, you squash your ear, i.e., squamous suture, the ear squashing. All right, anyway. Um, so we have a lot of other bones here. So let's look at, we got our sphenoid bone, sphenoid, nasal bone, lacrimal bone. You can see that in this kind of dark pink in here. Ethmoid bone is the green. If that is hard to distinguish, I apologize. Um, then you have your maxilla, right? Maxilla is going to form that upper portion of the jaw. You got your zygomatic bone that is going to form your cheekbone in addition to the extensions of your temporal bone. So they call that the zygomatic arch, where you have a zygomatic process of the temporal bone and a temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Okay, so together that makes a zygomatic arch. My favorite is that mastoid process. That's that hard, bony bump behind your ear. We also have ourselves the mandible, right? We have this mastoid process. The external acoustic meatus, okay? Also called the external auditory meatus, depending on your sources. Let's go ahead and hide this floating. Get it out of the way. All right, very cool. What else do I need to cover? Okay, so by the way, this is just a lateral view. You need to be familiar with all the views. Notice it gets a little bit more complicated when you see that frontal or anterior view. All right, so I'm not going to point out the big stuff. You can see that just fine. Okay, I was going into the little things. Notice your ethmoid bone, that green. You can also see that internally, right? And these are very specific bony projections. This is called the middle nasal concha of, and that is part of the ethmoid. So the middle nasal concha of the ethmoid, okay? You also have an inferior nasal concha, but it's not of the ethmoid, okay? It's of that zygomatic. As you can see here, it's in that different color. You have your nasal bone, you can see that here. Making up the eye socket, you can see the sphenoid bone is going to make up part of that. The ethmoid bone, your maxilla is going to make up part of that. You've got part of what is called the palatine bone, which is or palatine, however you want to say it. It's that little yellow one. And so all together, these are going to make up the eye socket. Oh, in addition to the zygomatic bone. Don't want to leave that out. So those are the smaller pieces. You can go ahead and view those larger pieces on your own. And I highly suggest going through all of these because they are all testable and awesome and cool, right? So let's go ahead and look at the underside of it. So this is going to be the inferior portion, inferior view of the skull. And you can see many of those same bones are visible from the interior. But now we have this new one popping in, the vomer. You can see that vomer here. It's going to basically add separation to the right and the left side. You also have the styloid process. You can remember it. It looks like a pencil, right? And a stylus is a pencil. So the styloid process. You're starting to see a lot of the fossil now. Okay, so we have and the fossa, the foramen, the foramina, and so fossa is going to be that divot, mandibular fossa. Um, Condyles are going to be projections, right? Occipital condyle. This is where your very first cervical vertebrae is going to articulate. So as you go through your inferior view, you're definitely going to see a lot more of those foramen, of the foramina, of the canals. And so as you see here, you have a carotid canal, okay? And so actually, let's go ahead and go from the top and go down. So if you can find your sphenoid bone, okay? When you find your sphenoid bone, you will find towards the medial portion, the foramen lacerum. Okay, so that is going to be found with the temporal and the occipital bones in between there. You also have your foramen ovale. Okay, so these have very specific functions in what allows to be passed. So the foramen lacerum. That is where your internal carotid artery is going to pass after leaving the carotid canal. Also, your auditory tube. The foramen ovale, it's an oval shape. Yeah. That is where you're going to have your mandibular division and then also your your trigeminal nerve. And so when you look at your temporal bone, in your temporal bone, you can find right here, your external auditory meatus. Okay. And so basically, the air in that meatus is going to conduct sound into the eardrum. And then you can see more medial to that, and we're in the temporal bone. So the key is to find your bones. That way you can locate the holes and know which ones. So this is the carotid canal, and it is going to allow the internal carotid artery to pass through. As we saw up here, then it's going to go to the foramen lacerum. All right, and then we have our stylomastoid foramen. At that point, in the styloid mastoid, it's just a tiny hole. You're going to have your facial nerve pass through. Let's find our occipital bone. Our occipital bone, you're going to have the largest hole, foramen magnum. Okay, sometimes they call it the magnum foramen, doesn't matter. That is where your brainstem is going to pass through, specifically the medulla oblongata, which is going to be the most caudal portion of the brain. Think about the caudal fin of a fish, the end of it, right? You're also going to have accessory nerve number 11. You're going to have your vertebral arteries passing through there. Okay. And then we're going to go ahead and move to this side, which is really, it's on both sides. I think they're just trying not to be too busy. And that's where you're going to find the jugular foramen. Just know, all the holes on this side are the same as all the holes on this side. Okay. Why they decided to point over here, I don't know. They could have just pointed right over here. Um, that is basically that jugular foramen. You're going to find your glossopharyngeal nerve, your vagus nerve, and your accessory nerve. So nerve 9, 10, and 11. And same with this accessory nerve too. So you're going to have two passages for those accessory nerves, 11. You're also going to have your internal jugular vein. So at least that's nice. Jugular vein goes through the jugular foramen. Okay, so let's open up the skull and look at it from the inside. Basically, they cut the skull in half. You can see it's a sagittal cross section. And now we can go ahead and view the skull from that inside. You can see the shape and structure of the parietal bones, of the occipital bones, of the frontal bones, and then also of the temporal bone. Okay, so while you're in here, you can also view the sinuses, right? You got your frontal sinus. That's going to be in the frontal bone, so that's nice. In your ethmoid bone, right? Here is the green, it's the ethmoid bone. You're going to have structures called the crista galli and the cribriform plate. So the cribriform plate is just that, a plate. The crista galli are going to be all of the holes, okay? All of the foramina. Um, and so, or so it's going to hold all of the holes. And the holes are called olfactory foramina. That's not on this picture, but you will see it on later pictures. And so we have this vomer bone. The vomer bone is going to basically help to separate your septum right and left. It is also attached to the palatine bone. And then the palatine bone is basically going to be this back portion. It's in yellow. It's this back portion of the maxilla bone. So when you put your tongue to the roof of your mouth, you feel the maxilla bone. Now, if you slide all the way back where you're almost at the soft palate, but there's a differentiation, that is the palatine bone. Okay. So basically, sometimes they call it the palatine process of the maxilla bone. So you will see it said both ways. All right. So we have the sutures that you can see. In the occipital bone, we have the hypoglossal canal. Okay. Remember, we're looking from the inside. And you can see, I'm sorry, the occipital bone, the hypoglossal canal. I pointed the wrong area. And then the foramen magnum is going to be attached under here. And what is that? Once again, it is the big hole where the caudal portion of the brainstem, specifically the medulla oblongata, is going to go through and then eventually follow through to be the spinal cord. So this is a section that is a horizontal section of the skull. You have your frontal bone, right? So just kind of getting some directionality. So this is the anterior portion of your skull. This is your occipital bone. So this is the posterior portion of the skull. Okay. So we are finding the crista galli. Remember I told you the crista galli is going to be a projection that is on the cribriform plate. Okay, so this is the cribriform plate. And then you're going to have all these tiny holes called olfactory foramina. And basically, that is where the chemical smells are going to go through. And there's going to be nerves and such that are going to collect that chemical information and then send that to the brain. So you have yourself the sella turcica. Okay, here is the section of the sella turcica. And then, so we got all of these lovely things. Okay, very cool. All right, so let's talk about some sinuses. So the sinuses are going to be air-filled chambers in the skull. The function of them to decrease the weight of the skull. They're lined with mucous membranes, which helps to produce mucin, which moistens and cleans the air. Okay, also serves as a resonating chamber in speech production. Okay. So this is just kind of a little review of those cranial bones. We'll kind of push through. Let's talk about the functions of those. So the function of the occipital bone, general function, forms most of the posterior and the inferior surfaces of the cranium. So the function is going to be shape and structure. The joints, your occipital bone is going to have joints of the parietal bones, going to share joints with the parietal bones, the temporal bones, the sphenoid bones, and the first cervical vertebrae, which is C1, is called the atlas. It has very specific markings. You're going to have to learn all of these markings. You'll look at your lab and you'll see what specific markings you're going to be held to on your lab practicals. And so you have your external occipital protuberance, right? Think about it protruding, right? It's small bump at the midline of the inferior of the surface. Then you have an external occipital crest. That is attachment for the ligamentum nuchae, right? And then so your occipital condyles, those are what articulates with that first atlas vertebrae. C1 is the atlas. Your inferior and your superior nuchal lines are going to be attachment sites for muscles and ligaments. Oh, I was hoping for a picture, silly me. Let's go through this and then we'll look at the picture. You have those foramina we talked about, or foramen on that occipital bone. Your biggest one of all, the foramen magnum. You have your jugular foramen. You also have your hypoglossal canals. So here we go. So I really wanted to point out the inferior and the superior nuchal lines. So when you see here, this is the superior nuchal line, and the one below it is the inferior nuchal line, okay? So we are looking from the inferior view. So if you were to turn the skull over, you would see that the superior nuchal line is superior in directionality to the inferior one. And right down the middle, that is your external occipital protuberance and external occipital crest is what lines down the middle, the protuberance, the crest. Next, the functions of the parietal bones. Parietal bone function generally to form the superior and the lateral surfaces of the cranium. They share joints with each other, the occipital, the temporal, the frontal, and the sphenoid bones. They have markings that you need to be familiar with. The superior and the inferior temporal lines, they will attach the temporalis muscle, okay? And there's also grooves for the cranial blood vessels. So you can see the inferior temporal line and that superior temporal line. Next is the frontal bone. The frontal bone is going to form the anterior portion, right? The front of the body, the front of the cranium, and the roof of the eye socket. It's also going to contain the frontal sinuses, okay? The joints that it participates and shares with, it shares a joint with the parietal bone, the sphenoid bone, ethmoid, nasal, lacrimal, maxillary, and zygomatic bone. It's really important that with all of these bones, you know what other bones they articulate with or share joints with. So the markings that you're going to find on the frontal bone, you're going to find your forehead. I can do that one. That sounds great. The supraorbital margin, which is going to protect the eye, glabella, which is between the supraorbital margins, lacrimal fossa for the lacrimal gland, and the frontal sinuses. So the foramina that you're going to find there are going to be supraorbital foramen, i.e. foramina, right? For the blood vessels. So not only are they size, but it's also having to do with singulars and plurals. All right, so blood vessels, eyebrows, eyelids, and frontal sinus. So that's what you will see the formation of the supraorbital foramen. You also have your supraorbital notch. That's an incomplete foramen. So we see here, we have our supraorbital margin, right? The margin and the supraorbital notch. That is an incomplete foramen, as you see from the previous slide. You have your superior temporal line. We saw that on the last slides. Your frontal suture. Some of this is fused on some people, but some is not completely fused. So just kind of looking on the inferior portion or the orbital surface, the inferior orbital surface, you can see your lacrimal fossa, your supraorbital foramen, frontal sinus. You can see it's definitely a hollow portion of the bone, and that supraorbital margin where it makes that eyebrow, that brow ridge. Moving on to those temporal bones. The temporal bones, the general functions are going to form parts of the lateral walls of the cranium and the zygomatic arches. Okay, we talked briefly about the zygomatic arch and how it extends and connects with that temporal bone to make that cheekbone. And so the temporal bones will also articulate with the mandible. It's going to surround and protect the internal ear, will attach jaw muscles and head muscles. The joints that it articulates with, zygomatic, or that the joints that it forms through articulating with other bones are zygomatic, sphenoid, parietal, occipital bones, and mandible bones. So these are the markings. I'm going to go ahead and scoot that through because we're going to talk about each of them. The squamous part is going to border on the squamous suture. Sometimes we see this called as the squamous portion. Zygomatic process, that's inferior to the squamous part. It's going to articulate with the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, and together they make the zygomatic arch. The mandibular fossa is going to be where it articulates with the mandible. The mastoid process. The mastoid process is for muscle attachment. Specifically, my favorite, the sternocleidomastoid. And that is a muscle that goes from the sternum and the clavicular portion of it all the way up your neck to that mastoid process. So the mastoid process is going to contain mastoid cells that connect to that middle ear cavity. Your styloid process are going to attach tendons and ligaments of the hyoid and the tongue and the pharynx. So notice these big ones. We're talking process. They're projections. They are attaching muscles in their function. And then you have your petrous part. Petrous part is going to include the structures for the inner ear. So moving into those auditory ossicles, you have 3 tiny bones in that tympanic cavity, which is the inner ear. It's going to help to transfer sound vibrations from the tympanic membrane eardrum to that inner ear. So when we look at the foramina of the temporal bones, these are the ones that we talked about already a little bit. The carotid canal for the internal carotid artery, the foramen lacerum. It's going to contain hyaline cartilage, small arteries, and the auditory tube. So, got a lot of good jobs there. You also have your external acoustic meatus, sometimes called your external auditory meatus. That is going to end at the tympanic membrane. Your stylomastoid foramen is for the facial nerve. Internal acoustic meatus is going to contain blood vessels and nerves of the inner ear and facial nerve. So, this was a lot. This is stuff that we already talked about in the previous slides. So, as I said it a second time, I'm going to let you look at this picture and find your own connections. Because as many times as I can say it, students and the learner has to do it. Let's move on to the sphenoid. The sphenoid, the general functions of the sphenoid is going to form parts of the floor of the cranium. It's going to unite cranial and facial bones, strengthen the sides of the skull. Okay. Also is going to have their own sinuses called sphenoidal sinuses. The joints that it makes are going to be with ethmoid bone, the frontal, occipital, parietal, temporal, palatine, zygomatic, maxillae, and the vomer. Wow. Has a lot of articulations has articulations with a lot of bones. So looking at that sphenoid, you're going to have those regions and markings that we didn't cover all of these before, but what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to go through them, and then since we didn't go over all of these before, I am going to go ahead and show them on the pictures again. Either way, we're looking at it at least one time on the pictures, and then giving you the opportunity to be able to do that on your own too. All right, so we have the body. The body is going to form the central axis of the sphenoid bone. Okay. You have the sella turcica or turcica. It is going to look like a saddle. You'll see what I'm talking about. It's a saddle shape enclosure on the superior surface of the body of the sphenoid. You have your hypophyseal fossa, which is a depression within that sella turcica, and it's going to hold that pituitary gland. Within your sphenoid bone, you also have those sphenoid sinuses. It's going to be one on each side, and they're going to be inferior to the sella turcica. You have greater wings and lesser wings. Oops, I should have gone the other way. Lesser wings and greater wings. Your lesser wings are going to extend horizontally, anterior to the sella turcica. And the greater wings are going to extend laterally. That sounds great. From that body. And they are going to form parts of that cranial floor, the posterior wall orbit. The sphenoidal spine is going to lie at the corner of each of those wings. Then you have something called the pterygoid process. Think about a pteranodon, right? What does a pteranodon have? These extensions of its arms. And so the pterygoid processes are going to form pterygoid plates, which are going to serve as attachment for muscles to the lower jaw and the soft palate. Wow, the sphenoid seems pretty important. What do you think? Yeah. So let's talk about the foramina of the sphenoid. You have your optic canals for the optic nerves. You have your prechiasmic sulcus, which is basically a groove. It's an optic groove. A sulcus is a groove. A fissure is also a groove. And so you have your superior orbital fissure. That's going to be for your blood vessels and your nerves of the orbit. You have your foramen rotundum and your foramen ovale. Those are going to be for your blood vessels and the nerves of the face and the jaw. So your foramen spinosum for your blood vessels and the nerves of the membranes. All right, so let's take a peek on the picture. So we are looking at the superior surface and we're looking inside the cranium, okay? So you can see here, we are taking that sphenoid bone. Now, when you look at the sphenoid bone, you should be able to see the sphenoid bone and see the structures while articulated with the skull. Or if the sphenoid bone was taken off and put on the table, you should be able to identify the structures, the bony landmarks either way. So what do we have here? The sella turcica. Remember, it's like that saddle. We have, it's a little bit hard to see in this direction, but we'll be able to see it in this direction. So I'm going to do this one first. You have your lesser wings, right? You have your greater wing. Kind of see the difference. You have your foramen ovale. It's like an oval shape. Your foramen spinosum. It's a lot smaller, right? Foramen rotundum. A little harder to see. We'll see it better in the other view. Prechiasmic sulcus is going to be anterior to the sella turcica. You have an optic canal. It's hard to see in this directionality, but you'll be able to see it in the next ones. And you have your sphenoidal spine. Okay, so now we're looking at the anterior surface. So you can see with the skull, if we're peeking into those eye sockets, this is how we see the sphenoid bone. Okay, so as you can see here, we got the body of the sphenoid. We have our pterygoid process right here. And at the end of the pterygoid process, you have your pterygoid plates. Okay. You can see your foramen rotundum a little bit better. Notice back here, your foramen rotundum was hard to view. So your foramen rotundum is better at this view. You got your greater wing. Okay, a little bit harder to see on this one, kind of. You have your lesser wings right here. Here's your sphenoidal sinus. It's going to be that open air space. And you have your superior orbital fissure. Some sources do say your supraorbital fissure also. All right, let's go into another really big bone, and it's called the ethmoid bone. So the general functions of that ethmoid bone is going to be for enteromedial floor of the cranium. Ooh, that's a big word, right? So it's going to help to build that floor of the cranium, the anterior side and the medial side. It is going to help to form the roof of the nasal cavity, part of the nasal septum, and the medial orbital wall, the eye socket, the medial portion of it, the closest, the side towards, come in towards that nose, or the midline of the body. How about we use that as that directionality? All right, it's going to contain ethmoidal cells, which is basically a network of sinuses. It's going to articulate with frontal bone and form joints with frontal bone, sphenoid bone, maxillae, nasal, lacrimal, palatine, inferior nasal concha, and the vomer. So the markings, the regions and the markings are cribriform plate, ethmoidal labyrinth, and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone is usually how it is said. Excuse me. Cribriform plate is going to form the roof of the nasal cavity. And also the floor of the cranium, at least part of it. It is going to contain the crista galli to attach to a falx cerebri. We'll show that in the picture here soon. It is going to have ethmoidal labyrinths, which is going to have those ethmoidal cells in basically the air-filled cavities. That's what the ethmoidal cells are. Superior nasal concha, the middle nasal concha. If you've ever used this word concha or concha to refer to an invertebrate, basically a gastropod. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, it's in the ocean, looks like snail. Okay. If you've seen their shells, that's the concha. It has to do with the shape and the opportunity for resonance, and also the opportunity for the airspace in between. You have your perpendicular plate, which is going to form part of the nasal septum. So your ethmoid the ethmoid foramina, excuse me, is going to have those olfactory foramina. We talked about them. There are going to be found little tiny holes in the cribriform plates. The purpose for those is for the olfactory nerves to pass. As you see here, so we are looking at the ethmoid bone and we're looking at the superior surface. We're looking at the interior of the cell. Here is your sphenoid bone. Do you see it right there? Boom. Here's your ethmoid bone right here. And so as you see it, we have let's go ahead and find cribriform plate first, right? It's a plate. Hard to see in this directionality, but we will see in the next one. And this section going down the middle, that is the crista galli. And it's going to extend the perpendicular plate. We will get an anterior view of that, and you will probably see why it is called the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. So, your olfactory foramina are going to be the little tiny holes that are found on the cribriform plate that allows the passage for the olfactory nerves. And then this section here, the ethmoid labyrinth. So let's look at the posterior surface of the ethmoid bone. You can see that perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. You can also see the middle nasal concha and the superior nasal concha. And you can see the crystal galli from here too. Ah, I wanted to see the hookup. So that's all right. We'll just save that exciting stuff for the next few slides. So let's go a little bit more into the facial bones. We are going to slide back around with this perpendicular plate when we start talking about some of these other facial bones. Okay, so we were talking about the cranial bones, now the facial bones. So you have maxilli, palatine, excuse me, nasovomer, inferior nasal concha, zygomatic, lacrimal, mandible, and the hyoid. So the maxilli, basically the general functions to support the upper teeth, to form the inferior orbital rims, to form the lateral margins of the external nares, to form the upper jaw, and most of the hard palate contains maxillary sinuses, which are going to be the largest of the sinuses. It's going to form joints with and articulate with frontal bones, ethmoid, and with another. I don't know why they're holding on to that one. So anyway, so all of the facial bones is going to form joints with all the facial bones except for the mandible. Okay, but we'll show you what the mandible articulates with. This should probably not have been a comma. It should have been and with one another. That just means the right and the left maxilla are going to joint together. So it just read kind of strange. So I just wanted to go ahead and circle back on that. All right, so what do we have here? Regions and markings. So your orbital rim, it's going to protect the eye and the other sutures. So you're going to find this as one of the markings of the maxillae. You're going to have your anterior, so it's towards the front of the body, nasal spine, which attaches to the anterior nasal septum. Your alveolar process is going to support the upper teeth. Your palatine process is going to form most of the hard palate. I had given this away when we were looking at the big picture of the bones. The maxillary sinuses are going to lighten the bone. That way, that facial bone isn't so heavy. The nasolacrimal canal is going to protect the lacrimal sac and the nasolacrimal duct. So let's talk about the foramina. So you have your infraorbital foramen. That's where your sensory to the brain is, sensory nerve to the brain is going to go through via the foramen rotundum of the sphenoid. You're also going to have an inferior orbital fissure. That's going to be for cranial nerves and blood vessels. So what do we have? We're looking here at the maxilla bone. Okay, let's go ahead and pull it away because we might need to look at that. The alveolar process. So basically, where the attachments where the tooth go in, that's the alveolar process. The anterior front portion of the nasal spine, the infraorbital foramen, the orbital rim, and the zygomatic process. So the next facial bone that we'll talk about is the palatine bone. That palatine bone is going to have general functions. It's going to form posterior portions of the hard palate, contribute to the floors of the orbits, form and articulate with each other, because there's a right and a left, maxillae, sphenoid, ethmoid, inferior nasal concha, and the vomer. With that palatine bone, you're going to have a horizontal plate that is going to form the posterior part of the hard palate. Okay, so if you think about with the anterior part of your body versus the posterior part. Now put your tongue on the roof of your mouth. Now slide it as back as far as you can and fill that hard part, right? So that's what we're talking about, that horizontal plate of that posterior part of that hard palate. Then you have your perpendicular plate. That is going to extend from that horizontal plate to the orbit process of the orbit floor. A little bit hard to find that with your tongue, but I'll find it in a picture for you. If I try to do that, it just tickles so hard it makes me want to sneeze, and I won't find it. So, the foramina that are going to be found, there's going to be many in the lateral portion of the horizontal plate. The purpose is for small blood vessels and nerves of the roof of the mouth. So, as you can see here, so we got a little cutaway of the maxilla. This is your palatine bone and horizontal plate right here. Okay, we're looking at the alveolar process. Let's see, we can see our maxillary sinus, our palatine process. Now, when we look here, we can see with the anterior view of the two palatine bones, here is the horizontal plate, okay? Here's the perpendicular plate. Why is it perpendicular? Well, essentially, it's almost perpendicular to the horizontal plate. And then the orbital process, this is going to form part of that eye socket. Moving on to those nasal bones. We have 97 slides. We're on 69, guys. We're almost there. Nasal bones, general functions are going to support the bridge of the nose to connect cartilage of the distal parts of the nose, right? Proximal, distal. Proximal's closest to that origin, distal's furthest away from that origin, or that part of the body that you are talking about. So that is going to extend to the external nerves. The joints it's going to form because it articulates with each other. One right nasal bone articulates with the left nasal bone. Also the ethmoid, frontal, and maxillae. That's it. That's all she wrote. Let's move on to the vomer. The vomer bone is going to form the inferior portion of the bony nasal septum. Okay. Articulating with the maxillae, the sphenoid, the ethmoid, the palatine bones, and also cartilaginous parts of the nasal septum. We're going to get a picture of all of this here soon, I promise. You have your inferior nasal concha. Purpose is to slow the inhaled air. When you take a deep breath through your nose, these will actually provide surface area to slow the bringing in of the air. And that's actually important. because it's essential to warm the air before it comes in. It needs to achieve closer to our body temperature. And so it also creates air turbulence inside that nasal cavity, sometimes a little bit too much when it becomes too big of a snore, right? So also helps to humidify the air that is coming into that nasal cavity. It's going to articulate with the maxillae, the ethmoid, palatine, and the lacrimal bones. Your zygomatic bones, we've talked about this a lot, contributes to the rims and the lateral walls of the orbits. We saw that in the eye socket. It also is going to form parts of the zygomatic arch to help to form that cheekbone. It's going to form joints because it articulates with maxilla, sphenoid, frontal, and temporal bones. So when you're looking at your zygomatic bones, it has some markings, like for example, the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. That is where the zygomatic process, where it meets the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. All right, let's put it together. Actually, let's wait for the picture. Let's wait for the picture. Foramina. The foramina that the zygomatic bones have are the zygomaticofacial foramen for the sensory nerve of the cheek. Moving on to the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal bone is going to be the smallest facial bone. It's going to form parts of the medial walls of the orbits, joints with the frontal, the maxilla, and the ethmoid. It's going to have markings, specifically the lacrimal sulcus, which is where you're going to find your lacrimal sac and leads to the nasal lacrimal canal. Wow, okay, that was a mouthful. Let's see what we can find on our picture. So it looks like we got two parts, so that's good. All right, so we have ourselves. So let's go from the top to the bottom. How about that? The supraorbital foramen, sometimes called the superior orbital foramen. Okay. Nasal bone, you have a right and a left. Okay. Notice I said it the opposite because I'm actually facing the skeleton. And so, ooh, I said it wrong. If I'm looking at, so this, no, I said it right. Silly me. All righty. You want to put yourself in anatomical position. So you put yourself in the skeleton's view. Okay. So this is the left nasal bone. This is the right nasal bone. Sorry if I fiddled on that one. All right, here's your sphenoid bone for this view when we're showing the building of the orbit. Temporal, zygomaticofacial foramen. There's a hole in there, not quite visible, but it's there. You got your zygomatic bone right here, right? You have your maxilla right here, your infraorbital foramen, sometimes called your inferior orbital foramen, depending on your sources. You have here the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Notice how it articulates with the vomer. In some sources, they call it the perpendicular plate of the vomer bone. But because your source isn't naming it that way, here's the deal. I'll take it either way. Okay. Might just be easier to call it the vomer rather than adding more words to it, though. Together, they make up the bony nasal septum. So let's look at the lacrimal sulcus. You can see that here. Lacrimal is basically tear duct area, right? Optic canal is where, right there. You got your superior orbital foramen, fissure, excuse me. So not quite a foramen. It's more of a slash. It's a fissure. You have your lacrimal bone right here, lacrimal sulcus, lacrimal bone. You have your middle nasal concha right here, your inferior nasal concha. And now we can get, so we already saw the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone and the vomer bone. We can now see from this angle a little bit On this zygomatic bone, we can see the temporal process of that zygomatic bone. And then from this view, you can also see the mastoid process. If you put your finger right underneath your ear, you can feel this bony projection. That is your mastoid process. Moving on to the mandible. Mandible, the general functions are going to be to form the lower jaw. The joints are going to be the mandibular fossae of the temporal bones. The markings, we're going to have a body, alveolar part, mental protuberance, which attaches facial muscles. You have a depression in the medial surface down the middle, right, of the submandibular salivary gland. You have your myeloid line for the insertion of the myeloid muscle. Myeloid. And you have your ramus. Your ramus is, it's going to be ascending from the angle of the mandible on both sides, either side. On each of the ramus, you're going to find a condylar process, a coronoid process, and a mandibular arch. Condylar process is going to articulate with the temporal bone at the temporomandibular joint. The coronoid process is going to be an insertion point for the temporalis muscle, which helps to close the jaw. And the mandibular notch is going to separate that condylar and the coronoid process. So let's talk about the foramina. You have your mental foramina. Those are for your sensory nerves of the lips and the chin. You have your mandibular foramina. That's going to be your entrance to the mandibular canal for blood vessels, nerves, and of the lower teeth. All right, let's check it out. So this right here is the mandible, right? The big bulk of it is the body, okay? Here's the angle, here's the ramus, right? And with that ramus, you're going to have this extension, which is the condylar process, and there's the head of it. You have this mandibular notch. A notch is exactly what it says it is. This is a coronoid process. Coronoid process, right? It's just showing on the right side versus the left side. This right here at that head is going to be the articular surface where the temporomandibular joint are. A lot of times people think that the mandible is going to articulate with the maxilla, and it does not. It articulates with the temporal muscle. Okay. I'm sorry, temporal muscle, my bad. Temporal bone. Alrighty, so let's look here. So the part of the chin that juts out is called the mental protuberance. The holes in each side, the right and the left side, you can't see the other side. That's the mental foramen. That's where you're going to have those blood vessels and nerves. And so I believe sensory nerves, excuse me, for the lips and the chin. The alveolar part, we talked about that. Alveolar part, where the teeth essentially are attached to the bone. It's not the teeth themselves, but where it attaches to the bone. So I believe we covered all of these. Myhaloid line, that is just that line that goes here, if you can see. And the depression for the submandibular salivary gland is underneath it. You can go ahead and feel your own jaw. See if you can feel these things. As you're learning all of this anatomy, try to find it on yourself. Because listening to me, it is not going to get absorbed through osmosis. It has to be practiced over and over and over again. All right, we're almost there, friends. The hyoid bone. It supports the larynx. It attaches muscles of the larynx, pharynx, and tongue. It's going to joint through stylohyoid muscle. It is going to joint through stylohyoid ligaments, which are going to connect the lesser horns to the styloid process of the temporal bones. And you're like, what are you saying? It is a free-floating bone. and it connects to other bones via ligaments. It does not have direct articular connections to other bones. It does not directly articulate. Alrighty. So the body of the hyoid. The thing is, body is very general throughout all the bones, so that's good. So it's going to attach muscles of the larynx, pharynx, tongue. We already talked about that. The greater horns are going to be what supports the larynx, attaches the muscles of the tongue also. The lesser horns are going to attach the stylohyoid ligaments and support the hyoid and larynx. And as you see, you can see how it is that free-floating bone. The body is the bulk of it. The lesser horn, the greater horn. So as we finish up, we're going to finish up going over the orbitals, okay, the eye sockets, and how those bones are going to go ahead and form that eye socket. You have 7 bones that form that orbital complex. The frontal, which is the roof, maxilla, the roof. Maxilla, lacrimal, and ethmoid labyrinth form the orbital rim and the medial wall. Sphenoid and palatine bones. Your zygomatic bone is going to form the lateral wall and the rim of the orbit. So with that, once we learn these, we will also talk about that nasal complex and paranasal sinuses, which are going to be a function. They're going to be a result of all of these bones too. Excuse me. So what do we got here? We can go ahead and look at the socket, right? Orbital. We see the zygomatic. We see the frontal. I'm just going around in the circle, right? We see the lacrimal sulcus. We see the maxilla. I'm basically going around the circle to the middle. We see the sphenoid, and then that's the other part of the sphenoid. And we see the ethmoid. Last but not least, the palatine. A little bit harder when you're on a skull and you don't see the colored. But what you should do is try to find the sutures, okay? And just like I went in a circle and made my way around, that may be helpful for you also. So with that nasal complex, it's made up of bones that are enclosed, they enclose the nasal cavity and the paranasal sinuses. So you have your frontal bone, your sphenoid bone, and your ethmoid bone. Those are going to form the superior wall of the nasal cavities. You also have your maxilla, your lacrimal bones, ethmoid, and your inferior nasal concha. Those are going to form the lateral walls of the nasal cavities. And then you have your maxilla and your nasal bones. That is going to form the bridge of the nose. So this looks scarier than it has to be. Find your large bones. Find your directionality, right? We're looking at the anterior. This is the posterior. It is a sagittal cut down the middle. And we're looking at the inside. Specifically, here's that we're looking at the right side. So we have our frontal bone with the frontal sinuses, okay? You have your nasal bone right here. Let's find the big bones. We have our maxilla, right? That maxilla bone. From here, we can go ahead and find the folding ones. The folding ones are those conchae, the nasal concha of the ethmoid bone. You have one higher than the other, right? Superior, and then you got middle, and then you have inferior. So the superior and the middle are part of the ethmoid bone. The inferior is not part of the ethmoid bone. Then, if you head to the posterior part of those facial bones, you have the sphenoid. And in the sphenoid bone, you have a sphenoid sinus. All right. So, the paranasal sinuses, like the function of the paranasal sinuses, what they are is they're air-filled chambers. They connect to the nasal cavities. What they do is they help to lighten the skulls of the bone. connect mucous epithelium. Okay, we talked about mucosa being important for basically for to sterilize the air and to provide, excuse me, I need some right now to to provide moisture. So it's going to release mucus into that nasal cavity. So you have your frontal sinuses, your ethmoidal cells, which are, don't confuse them with a cell of a tissue cells. Think about a cell where you're going to put something. Alrighty. Sphenoidal sinus and your maxillary sinus. The fontanelles, last but not least, let's talk about how an infant skull is going to grow into an adult skull. Number one, very fast. If you ever watched a baby's head grow, a baby's head grows really fast, a lot faster than some parts of other parts of the body. It is large compared to those arms and those legs and that torso. Too adorable. I gotta be honest with you. Many ossification centers, which means it's not just growing in one direction in one place. It is growing in many directions, in many places. And the ossification is eventually going to meet and connect and find each other as that skull is going to near the end of its growth cycle when it's older children into adult. You get fusion of bones, not complete at birth. You have two fontanelles, four occipital bones. You have several sphenoid and temporal elements to them. The fontanelles, the purpose are the large areas of fibrous connective tissue, going to cover unfused sutures in the infant skull. It's going to also allow the skull to be flexible and contract during childbirth as it comes through the birth canal. So the sphenoidal fontanelles, you're going to find those in the junction of the squamous and the coronal sutures, mastoid fontanelles. I feel like you could read this on your own. I could just show you a picture, right? Okay, so you got your sphenoidal fontanelles. You're going to find them right here. Mastoid fontanelles, by the mastoid process, where that's going to be. You have your coronal suture right here. Yeah, very cool. Looking from the top, you can see your anterior fontanelle right here. Right, here's your nose, your nasal bone, and you have your posterior fontanelle. And you have your frontal suture and your sagittal suture. The frontal suture, that is the one that I was showing you in a previous picture, that for most people that has completely fused, but for some it has not. All right, very nice. I hope you enjoyed all 97 slides. I like doing it. All right.